Nearly 4 years into the brutal conflict that has ravaged Ukraine, the world has witnessed something unprecedented: the systematic disintegration of what was once considered a formidable military power. Russia's armed forces are hemorrhaging personnel at an alarming rate, their equipment systematically obliterated, and the financial burden of a campaign initially projected to last mere weeks has spiraled into an economic abyss that threatens the very foundation of the nation. Yet beneath the surface-level reporting of territorial shifts and body counts lies a narrative so disturbing, so fundamentally broken, that it exposes the true extent of Russia's military catastrophe. This isn't merely a story of soldiers falling to enemy fire. This is the harrowing reality of troops executed by their own leadership, of officers murdered by the men they commanded, of a military apparatus so thoroughly corrupted that it has begun to devour itself from within. What follows is an examination of the crisis unfolding inside Russia's disintegrating war machine, a crisis that may ultimately determine not just the outcome of this conflict, but the future of Russia itself. The reports emerging from the front lines aren't speculation. They're not propaganda manufactured by Ukraine's information warfare apparatus. These are documented accounts, verified through independent Russian journalism, intercepted military communications, and testimonies from soldiers who have lived through the nightmare. The investigative team at Verstka, an independent Russian media outlet operating under extraordinary danger, has uncovered a systematic practice of internal executions. Russian military personnel have coined a chilling term for this phenomenon: obnolia, literally translated as zeroing out. The phrase captures both the bureaucratic coldness and the finality of the act. A soldier is removed not just from duty rosters, but from existence itself. The investigation has documented 101 Russian servicemen implicated in these field executions. 79 of these cases have been corroborated through multiple independent sources, meeting the rigorous standards required to distinguish fact from rumor in a war zone saturated with disinformation. But these verified cases represent merely the tip of an iceberg whose true dimensions remain obscured. Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion, the main military prosecutor's office has logged more than 12,000 formal complaints. These aren't grievances about poor rations or inadequate equipment. These are allegations of Russian soldiers killing their own comrades. 12,000 complaints. Let that number settle in your mind. A source embedded within the main military prosecutor's office has revealed something even more damning. The agency has instituted an unofficial moratorium on investigating officers currently deployed in Ukraine. The rationale provided is that such inquiries might negatively affect military operations. In practice, this grants Russian commanders effective immunity to execute their subordinates with impunity, provided such actions don't catastrophically undermine combat effectiveness. To contextualize these numbers, Russia maintains approximately 700,000 troops deployed in Ukraine at any given time, not accounting for the estimated 1 million casualties already sustained. 12,000 complaints represent roughly 1.7% of the current active deployment. Alternatively, consider the temporal dimension. Over 1,345 days of warfare, this averages to nearly 9 instances per day. 9 daily reports of a Russian soldier executed by his own side, typically for refusing orders that were suicidal in nature. The techniques employed to zero out unwanted soldiers vary considerably, each method revealing another layer of organizational decay and moral bankruptcy. The most straightforward approach is immediate execution. This typically occurs when soldiers refuse participation in what military personnel grimly call meat assaults, human wave attacks launched without mechanized support, artillery coverage, or adequate reconnaissance. These men are simply shot at point-blank range in whatever trench they currently occupy. Medusa's investigative reporting uncovered the account of a mobilized soldier identified as Alexei. He described conditions within the 7th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade where refusal to participate in futile assaults meant immediate death by automatic weapons fire. Bodies were subsequently disposed of in nearby rivers or buried in shallow graves adjacent to the trenches where they'd served. In June of this year, a soldier operating under the call sign Fixa refused an order to serve as what commanders termed a beacon, essentially human bait sent forward without armor or weapons to draw Ukrainian fire and reveal defensive positions. For this refusal, he was beaten on camera, subjected to electric shock torture, and ultimately executed by firearm on his commander's direct order. Executions also occur during active operations. Commanding officers have begun deploying snipers whose primary targets aren't Ukrainian soldiers but their own troops attempting to flee combat or desert their positions. According to Alexei's testimony, 2 such snipers eliminated 20 soldiers from his unit in 2023, then 40 more in 2024. The grim calculus suggests either these snipers have continued their lethal work, adding dozens more to their tally, or they themselves have been zeroed out for refusing to execute additional troops, a possibility that speaks to the recursive nature of this brutality. Russia's drone operations have evolved to match Ukrainian capabilities, and this technological competence has been corrupted for internal enforcement. Reports from the 139th Separate Assault Battalion describe commanders holding drone operators at gunpoint while directing them to maintain visual contact with deployed infantry. If soldiers attempted retreat, operators were forced to deploy FPV kamikaze drones against their own retreating comrades. For those not immediately executed, a potentially worse fate awaits: systematic torture. Soldiers have been imprisoned in pits or makeshift cellars, denied sustenance and water, subjected to repeated beatings throughout each day. Some die from the accumulated trauma or starvation. Others are forced into gladiatorial combat, made to fight each other to death with the promise that the survivor earns release. Video footage from May captured 2 soldiers from the 114th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade confined in a pit, compelled to fight. An off-camera voice, allegedly belonging to a commander with the call sign, declares, "Whoever destroys the other one gets out of the hole." The recording shows the men fighting barehanded until one loses consciousness after being held in a chokehold for 60 seconds. The ultimate fate of both men remains unknown. When commanders choose not to execute soldiers directly, they can simply dispatch them on missions explicitly designed to be fatal. These troops are deployed without body armor, often without weapons, sometimes without any equipment whatsoever. Retreat becomes impossible because commanders also deploy barrier troops, soldiers whose sole function is maintaining the rear line and preventing withdrawal. These barrier troops force fleeing soldiers back toward combat or execute them on sight if they persist in attempting retreat. Ukrainian drone operators recently documented barrier troops using aerial assets to drop explosives on their own fleeing personnel, a practice that likely constitutes a war crime under humanitarian law. This represents a perversion of even Stalin's brutal barrier troop system, where such units would round up survivors for deployment to penal battalions sent on the most dangerous missions. Even then, immediate execution was considered wasteful. The current Russian military has abandoned even that minimum. All pragmatism. When Russian soldiers are executed by their own commanders, the resulting corpses rarely return home with truthful documentation. Bodies are buried in forests or abandoned on battlefields with additional rounds fired over them to simulate combat deaths. Official records classify these men as missing in action or deserters, classifications that conveniently deny families any compensation. Vladislav Berlyakov from the 6th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade witnessed his comrade, identified by the call sign Odessa, beaten to death by commanding officers. According to his testimony, they dressed the corpse in deteriorated body armor and a helmet, placed 2 grenades beneath the body, and detonated them. To obscure the beating evidence that forensic examination might detect, the remains were left in summer heat for several days until decomposition began. Only then was the body sent home, labeled "killed in action." When families manage to file formal complaints, they encounter a system deliberately engineered to protect perpetrators. The source within the military prosecutor's office explained the unofficial prohibition on investigating officers serving in combat brigades. These officers effectively enjoy immunity from prosecution until the war concludes, however and whenever that might occur. Even when investigators from Russia's Federal Security Service attempted pursuing these cases, they encountered systematic obstruction from military and administrative authorities. According to one FSB investigator, witnesses routinely ended up dead, often with injuries such as evisceration or slashed throats, deaths officially recorded as suicides despite clear evidence suggesting homicide. Meanwhile, Russian state media continues broadcasting carefully choreographed propaganda, triumphant soldiers reuniting with grateful families, narratives of heroism and sacrifice that couldn't be further divorced from the brutal reality. Verska's investigation and soldier testimonies reveal a toxic convergence of desperation, sadism, and overwhelming greed driving these executions. Some commanders resort to killings because they perceive no alternative method of controlling troops who recognize they're being sent to certain death. In a military culture constructed on rigid obedience rather than professional competence, terror becomes a straightforward, economical, and effective management tool. However, the most prevalent motive appears to be simple avarice. Russian soldiers receive substantial compensation for combat injuries, up to 3 million rubles, approximately $35,000. Commanders have transformed this into an extortion enterprise. The mother of Andrei Bykov, who served in the 80th Guards Tank Regiment's assault company, described how her son was murdered after receiving injury compensation. Commanders using the call signs Dudka and Kemer demanded half the payout. Bykov refused and purchased a Toyota Camry instead. When commanders ordered him to surrender the vehicle and he again refused, they had him beaten to death. According to soldiers in the same unit, commanders extract money for equipment for avoiding assault missions for staying out of the Tortu pits. One source claimed a military police officer connected to unit command possessed 53 million rubles in his bank account, over $600,000. Some commanders allegedly force soldiers to surrender bank cards and PIN codes before assaults, ostensibly to pass them to relatives if something happens. The money, predictably, never reaches families. It simply transfers to commanders' accounts. Many Russian commanders are themselves suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, substance dependency, and psychological disintegration. Russia's defense ministry acknowledges that 20% of war veterans suffer from PTSD, yet the country maintains fewer than one therapist for every 7,000 adults, with even fewer experienced in treating combat trauma. Commanders returning for multiple deployments, witnessing constant death, operating in an environment of total impunity, become progressively more brutal. In some perverse, psychological state, they may genuinely believe that executing a soldier reinforces discipline among the survivors. The zeroing out practice hasn't gone uncontested. Russian soldiers are increasingly turning their weapons on the commanders attempting to kill them. In June, near Bakhmut in contested Donetsk territory, Russian troops from a motor rifle unit refused suicidal orders to storm fortified Ukrainian positions without adequate artillery or armored support. When their platoon commander threatened to execute soldiers who wouldn't advance, they shot him dead and surrendered en masse to Ukrainian forces. According to Ukrainian Defense Ministry intelligence, these soldiers subsequently provided detailed information about their unit's condition, the systematic abuse by commanders, and Russia's desperate manpower situation. The report omitted specific names and precise locations for security reasons, but confirmed that such mutinies are becoming increasingly frequent. This incident reveals a fundamental breakdown in military cohesion. Soldiers have concluded they possess better survival odds as Ukrainian prisoners of war than under their own commander's authority. On the front lines, they face threats from both directions. In a POW camp, they might at least experience some semblance of normalcy. This represents the ultimate failure of military morale. When troops would rather surrender to the enemy than continue serving their own nation, the war is effectively lost, regardless of how many square kilometers appear colored on military maps. Ukrainian intelligence has repeatedly publicized intercepted communications describing Russian soldiers discussing violence against their own officers. Ukraine's I Want to Live campaign specifically targets Russian soldiers with promises of humane treatment as prisoners and potential asylum. The campaign has proven remarkably effective, precisely because many Russian soldiers view Ukrainian captivity as preferable to serving under their own officers. The executions, desertions, and mass surrenders are accelerating Russia's already catastrophic demographic crisis. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, Russia has sustained an estimated 1,140,000 casualties, killed, wounded, treated, or permanently discharged. Additionally, by mid-2025, nearly 140,000 Russian soldiers had returned to civilian life after fighting in Ukraine, though it remains unclear whether this figure overlaps with the casualty count. What is documented is that returning soldiers face an economy deliberately structured to pressure them back into active service. Military contracts for soldiers in active combat zones pay approximately 3 times the national average salary, with substantial signing bonuses. Contract soldiers earn over 150,000 rubles monthly, roughly $1,800, with some reports suggesting 210,000 rubles or $2,600. These are amounts they'll never approach in civilian employment, where median salary stands at only 56,000 rubles per month, $700. This creates a permanent military caste dependent on continued warfare to maintain their standard of living. Veterans accustomed to high military pay to sustain themselves or their families now face approximately 70% pay cuts when out of service. The government deliberately sustains this trap through increased incentives for rejoining and reduced social programs for civilians. Russia's 2025 defense spending exceeds 8% of GDP and accounts for 40% of total federal expenditure, levels unseen since the Soviet Cold War era. Meanwhile, spending on social welfare policies is projected to decrease by nearly 16% year over year. The government is essentially bribing soldiers with money stolen from Russia's civilian population and future generations. British military intelligence revealed that 160 Russian hospitals closed in 2024, with medical resources redirected from civilian to military sectors. Ordinary Russians face systematic abandonment while soldiers receive preferential treatment, that is, until they return home and discover the support systems don't actually function. Veterans unable to find adequate employment or suffering from untreated PTSD are turning to crime at alarming rates. By March 2025, veterans had killed or maimed more than 750 people after returning home, mostly relatives and friends, in domestic violence incidents. Verska identified at least 190 criminal cases initiated against pardoned Wagner recruits in 2023 alone. These ex-convicts trained in modern warfare and released with legal impunity represent a law enforcement nightmare. Organized crime networks are recruiting former soldiers as contract killers and enforcers, creating yet another layer of organized criminality in a country already burdened with demographic challenges. The combination of systematic executions, plummeting morale, and economic unsustainability points towards several possible scenarios, none favorable for Russia. First, Russia could attempt compensating for mounting losses and desertion rates with even more aggressive recruitment campaigns. We're already witnessing signs of this. Medusa reported that recruitment in the second quarter of 2025 was less than one-third of the same period in 2024, suggesting the pool of willing recruits is rapidly depleting. This aligns with the announcement of the largest fall recruitment drive in the past decade, occurring precisely in 2025. The Kremlin will likely increase signing bonuses and monthly pay even further, accelerating the economic death spiral. But this approach yields diminishing returns. Eventually, no amount of money can overcome the knowledge that military service means death on the battlefield, execution by your own commander, or returning home to an economy that cannot sustain you. Second, Russia might be forced to abandon contested territory, particularly around Pokrovsk and other parts of Donetsk, as units become combat ineffective due to desertion, surrender, and internal violence. Ukrainian forces have already demonstrated the ability to encircle Russian units and force mass surrenders when morale collapses. In recent months, Ukraine achieved significant territorial gains in the Pokrovsk region through coordinated drone swarms and ground operations, liberating entire villages and securing the northern approaches to the city. Days ago, one of the largest vehicle-supported Russian attacks failed catastrophically as Ukraine destroyed 2 tanks and a dozen infantry support vehicles in a single engagement. If this pattern accelerates, and all indicators suggest it will, Russia could face cascading unit collapses across the entire front line. Commanders who've been executing their troops to maintain discipline may find their remaining soldiers simply surrendering or turning weapons on their officers en masse. Third, Russia might attempt to conclude the war through sheer desperation, launching overwhelming attacks regardless of casualties in a final attempt to break through Ukrainian defenses. This would require Russia to fully commit its remaining reserves and accept potentially catastrophic losses. This scenario is particularly dangerous because it could actually lead to tactical nuclear weapon deployment. If conventional forces prove insufficient and Russia faces complete military collapse, Putin might conclude that limited nuclear strikes against Ukrainian military targets represent his only option to force capitulation and save face. Such escalation could have irreparable consequences for the region. Ukraine would face massive pressure to surrender to prevent further nuclear attacks. NATO would face the decision of whether to directly intervene to prevent nuclear weapons use from becoming normalized in modern warfare, or cede all momentum and geopolitical influence to Russia and China. A potential NATO-Russia conflict brings about even worse escalation scenarios with possibilities for full-scale nuclear war if Putin senses his reign is ending and decides to depart catastrophica. Perhaps the more likely scenario involves Russia's military simply disintegrating from within before any of these external scenarios fully materialize. The losses could reach a tipping point where the military becomes functionally inoperable. Analysis from the Jamestown Foundation draws parallels to how veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War contributed to increased crime and social instability near the Soviet Union's end. But the scale this time is exponentially larger. While the Soviet-Afghan War deployed roughly 620,000 soldiers over 10 years, with 15,000 to 25,000 total casualties, Russia has suffered over 1 million casualties in less than 4 years, with approximately 1.5 to 2 million soldiers rotating through Ukraine. These returning veterans and active soldiers could significantly impact both local security and federal politics. They could become a revolutionary force demanding accountability for the commanders who sent them to die or executed their closest comrades, and the government that abandoned them upon return. If you found this investigation into the hidden crisis within Russia's military compelling, make sure to subscribe to IntelX. We deliver in-depth analysis on the most critical developments in global conflicts, cutting through propaganda to bring you the truth behind the headlines. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the stories that shape our world.